Mesdames et messieurs, merci d'être venus par un temps si glacial à ce vernissage national pour le nouveau bouquin de Jonathan Manthorpe, Claws of the Panda. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Brian Lee Crowley. I am the Managing Director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and I would like to welcome you to our special event, Claws of the Panda, Beijing's Campaign of Influence and Intimidation in Canada. If you're out in the entrance hall, please come in. Lots of room here. We've got lots of room at the front. Room for everybody. Thank you all for coming. As you might know, MLI has been a leader in Canada in raising tough questions about the global ambitions of the Chinese regime and its increasingly authoritarian rule. As China's vitriolic and aggressive response to our arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou has clearly demonstrated, Xi Jinping's China is not governed by the rule of law in any real or substantive way. If the Chinese Communist Party has a view about who should be prosecuted, when and why, and about what sentences should be handed down, they simply issue orders to the police and the judiciary. And this is clearly on display with the arrests of Canadians Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor and the resentencing of alleged drug smuggler Robert Schellenberg from prison to execution. As noted by MLI senior fellow Charles Burton, these represent cases of hostage diplomacy and death threat diplomacy. Yet, while we are rightly concerned about the safety of Canadians in mainland China, we should not ignore the dangers posed by Chinese actions much closer to home here in Canada. As described in a recent MLI paper by J. Michael Cole, a Canadian who lives now in Taipei, China has pursued sharp power influence operations against Canada and our allies, which rely increasingly on unsavory methods that use co-optation, bribery, incentivization, which is another word for bribery as far as I'm concerned, disinformation, censorship, and other means. Simply put, the Communist Party of China aims to turn Canadian public policy to China's advantage, to acquire useful technology and intellectual property, and to be able to monitor and intimidate Chinese Canadians and others. As part of these efforts, it has an ongoing campaign to embed agents of influence in Canadian business, Canadian politics, Canadian media, and Canadian academia. Unfortunately, Ottawa has failed to recognize or confront the efforts by the Chinese Communist Party to infiltrate and influence Canadian politics and to exert and to counter the efforts to exert control over Canadians of Chinese heritage. What are the dangers posed by China's influence operations? How should our government confront China's attempts to infiltrate and influence Canadian politics and society? To help answer these questions, MLI is pleased to host the national book launch for noted journalist Jonathan Manthorpe's new book, Claws of the Panda, Beijing's Campaign of Influence and Intimidation in Canada. And Jonathan will shortly be offering his thoughts on China's influence and intimidation campaign, which will be followed by a discussion with Bob Fife, the Ottawa Bureau Chief of the Globe. Is Bob here? Yeah, he's on his way. There will also be an opportunity to ask Jonathan questions during a Q&A and for him to sign your copy of the book. To set the stage for Jonathan's comments, I wanted to first introduce MLI's ambassador on Canada-China policy, Anastasia Lin, who will say a few words about her own experience and that of other Canadians of Chinese extraction in dealing with the Chinese regime. Anastasia has championed the cause of human rights throughout the media, at high-level speaking engagements. You might have seen a video of her, for example, at the Oxford Union, in national legislative bodies and through her award-winning work as an actress and a model. Please welcome Anastasia Lin to the platform.
Thank you so much for being here, everyone. This is unimaginable for me just a couple years ago. And I really would like to pay a special thanks to MLI for continuing their work on China, Because for people like me, Chinese Canadians, this would be a dream just a few years ago. I was born in China and lived there for 13 years. I had the privilege to move to Canada when I was 13 years old with my mother. And one of the gifts that I had was a chance to change my outlook in the world. I was raised in a dictatorship country where all our textbooks are manipulated. The history was manipulated. Our values, the true human spirit, was stifled. And growing up there, people started to become obedient. They stopped challenging anything in their life. And that's why we're seeing Chinese companies stealing Western technology today. Why? China used to be a culture that was so glorious in its innovation for 5,000 years. But now, under the communist regime, people have become tools on a massive production machine. So after I came to Canada, my mother started to give me these papers about Tiananmen massacre, about Falun Gong practitioners, about Tibetans, about Uyghurs, these persecution that I never heard of in China. In my 13 years in China, I have never heard of the Tiananmen massacre. And so I did my own research online. I started to watch videos. I started to read more articles about it. And the truth just got uglier and uglier. But there's also that excitement. It's like all you have been indoctrinated all your life is wrong. There's a chance that you can make a difference. And so after meeting another ambassador in MLI, Nazanin F. Xinjiang, who's Miss World Canada 2003, I decided that I was going to run for Miss World Canada so that I could potentially have a platform to tell these stories that was never told. A lot of these Chinese dissidents, they were persecuted in China. They moved out here. Their English is not very good, and they also have cultural barrier. Their way of protest, their way of speaking their mind is not really accepted by the Western society. They're not sophisticated enough, but it doesn't mean that they don't have a story to tell. It doesn't mean that what they did in China to resist the tyranny, and to speak up for their fellow Chinese is not courageous, and it doesn't deserve a front page in the New York Times. So I ran for Miss World Canada, and I thought that it was going to be a Wonder Woman's protection, like a shield for me, and all the evil from the world would just be blocked away from me. But I learned that's not really true. I had to learn to dodge the bullet myself later. And I won Miss World Canada. And I think part of it is because Canadians agree with what I was trying to say. My fellow countrymen, Canadians, they supported my human rights cause, and I won. And right after, my father was threatened because I ran on a human rights platform. And I was very general about it. For me, it was just like world peace, just like the other girls. And they threatened my father in China, and they said that if I continued to speak up, that my family would be persecuted like in the Cultural Revolution. And I think for my father's generation, the Cultural Revolution, the threat of that is the worst threat you can have. It means public humiliation, public persecution, your family, yourself being thrown into jail, your entire reputation destroyed, your economic destroyed, everything destroyed. And the worst is that Chinese people went through that process, had their dignity stripped away again and again through the Cultural Revolution, through the Tiananmen massacre, and now they learn to bow their head. They don't dare to challenge anymore. And that's why I wrote for the Washington Post after my father told me to not speak and leave them away to survive in China. Because I see so many Chinese Canadians, Chinese Americans, Chinese all over the world decided that conforming is the best way to keep their family safe. But I think the truth, my experience, proved the contradictory. After I spoke out, although the Chinese security guards continue to threaten my grandfather and my father, but they do it with caution. They used to threaten them with death threats. Now it's like with flowers and fruit. Could you please tell your granddaughter, like, what she's doing is not really good for our face in the international stage, so if she would just soften a little bit, she might be able to come back to China to see you guys again. Her mother might be able to come back to China, and we won't deny her visa anymore. What I'm trying to say here is that there's a lot of stories like this kind that was never heard until very recently, all around the world, not just in Canada. I've traveled to United Kingdom, Australia, Israel, everywhere, all corners of the world. And the Chinese people there would come up to me and tell me this is a global phenomenon. And this is the reason why the work MLI is doing right now is so profoundly important. For the first time forever, that I see Westerners starting to care about the well-being of Chinese people, not just Chinese Canadians, but the Chinese people. Because with the policy that we had in the past, be it United States or Canada, it's based on a false hope. We hope that Chinese Communist Party is not what it is. We deny the truth. We don't want to see them for what it is, the manipulative, this deceptive, and a regime of thugs. We want to see that they change, and mostly because of the economic interest. We're blinded by that in the past. And now I'm seeing that the global trend, the United States at least taking the lead in recognizing, confronting communists as what they are, and base their policies on that. And I hope this trend can continue. And I see that work MLI is doing in Canada is really helping in that front. And at last, I would like to remind everybody that we're talking about Chinese Communist Party today. We're not talking about the Chinese people. The real Chinese people in China, I see that the glorious 5,000 years of Chinese culture can never be replaced by an atheist dogma. They are trying, so we should use our liberty to advocate for there too. Not compromising our values, stand our ground would be the most important first step. Thank you very much.
Well done, well done. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you will agree with me that Anastasia is a genuine Canadian hero. And her presence here is doubly important because it puts the lie to what the ambassador of the People's Republic of China said about Canada the other day. He said, "We are a white supremacist regime." Nothing could be further from the truth. We are a society committed to the universal values of freedom and the rule of law for Chinese as well as everyone else, right? I think we still have room for you, Jonathan.
I was going to say, everything's been said. Nothing left for me to say.
Jonathan Manthorpe, besides being a friend of mine who I have admired for many years, is the author of 3 books. 4 books. 4 books on international relations, politics, and history. Over his 40-year career as a journalist, he's been the foreign correspondent in Asia, Africa, and Europe for Southern News, the European bureau chief for the Toronto Star, and the national political reporter for the Globe and Mail, amongst other things. I'm going to invite Jonathan to the platform now to give us, an overview talk about his book, and that will prepare the ground for the chat he's going to have with Bob Fife, and then questions from the floor. If there are people outside who want to come in, there's lots of room. Please move forward. Just come on in. We want you to hear what's going on. Jonathan.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Well, thank you, Brian, and thank you, MLI, for inviting me here. This is a great pleasure. I was thinking, I actually haven't been in Ottawa for 20 years, which is why I brought a rain hat from Victoria and not a toque. And but the last time I was here, and this is slightly pertinent, the last time I was here was in 1999 in April, and I was following the then Chinese Premier Zhu Rongji across the country, starting in St. John's and ending in Victoria, in Butchart Gardens, where else. He had just, of course, come up from Washington, where he'd been talking with Bill Clinton about joining the WTO, and Clinton had told him, no, not yet. So he was in a bit of a thoughtful mood as he came through here. But I knew Zhu Rongji a bit, because I'd reported on him in China when he was first the economic czar and very much the technological driving force in the early years of the turn to what they said at the time was a market economy, but was, you know, with Chinese characteristics. Then went on to be premier. I always rather liked him. He, of course, was not a very dedicated communist, which was why he never went on to be president or party leader. But I think the story of China over the last 30 years might have been very different if he had actually risen to power. But I don't think he had either the will or the capacity to take control of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that was probably, he may have been in recent years the best president China never had. The other reason why I was delighted to come back to Ottawa after 20 years was that I was hoping to see my first managing editor at the Globe and Mail, Clark Davey. He hired me in 1969. He was one of the most magnificent managing editors I'd ever worked for. He was a tremendous mentor for me. I quite literally would not be here today, I think, without his guidance and support over many years when I was at the Globe and Mail. But I was sad. I thought he might be at one of the occasions I'm here. But unfortunately, I opened the Globe and Mail this morning, and he died a few days ago, which is very sad. He was had a huge impact on a whole generation of journalists, young journalists in the 1960s and 70s. He, as managing editor with Dick Doyle as editor of the Globe and Mail, was one of those sort of combinations like Simon and Garfunkel, where you know, they are greater than the sum of the parts. It was an extraordinary time to be a young journalist, and I mourn his passing. But let me pick up from where Brian sort of led you. The Huawei affair has produced the worst crisis in Canada-China relations since mutual diplomatic recognition in 1970. But it is a crisis that, in my view, is to be welcomed and embraced. It is beyond time that Canada re-examined the relationship with the Chinese Communist Party, and equally important, that Beijing should be forcefully discouraged from continuing to take Canada for granted. Canadian policy and opinion makers need to sweep away the self-delusion that has clouded their view of the People's Republic of China for decades. They need to consider with clear heads what kind of relationship with the Beijing regime can be achieved realistically, and what benefits to Canada are truly possible. To that end, the Meng Wanzhou extradition case and Beijing's response by detaining two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, are something of a gift because they have exposed the fundamental incompatibility of our values. Ottawa has complied with our obligations under international treaties and has shown respect for the rule of law and the independent judiciary. I have to say, I was saying that with a good deal more firmness of tone until the story surfaced about SNC-Lavalin. Although I was already a bit queasy about explaining where John McCallum fitted into the whole picture of dedication to the rule of law. And since then, of course, Canada finds itself between two regimes of questionable legitimacy in Beijing and Washington, and neither of which seem to believe in the rule of law. It sounds as though Ms. Meng may be traded away for a trade deal between Canada and the US, and we can perhaps talk later about how we should expect and what we should expect for Beijing getting out of its kidnapping and hostage-taking. But thus, Beijing's response by kidnapping and holding hostage the two Michaels is a clear reminder that the CCP is not a regime with which any country can do business under normal rules of civil behavior. There have been plenty of warnings before the Huawei Meng affair of this gulf in values between Canada and the People's Republic of China. It is surprising that actually we've not had a crisis point before now. For example, in 2015, Canada faced a similar situation after an alleged spy of the CCP, Su Bin, was arrested here, again on an extradition warrant from the US Department of Justice. Beijing responded by kidnapping Canadians Julia and Kevin Garrett, who had lived for many years near China's border with North Korea, and where they ran a Christian missionary operation behind a coffee shop. They were released after many months in detention following Su Bin's decision not to contest the deportation, to go to the US voluntarily, and plead guilty to the spying charges. One has to think he probably got offered a good deal and decided it was better than going back to China. Then there was that stark and embarrassing lesson for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau when he went to Beijing in December 2017, apparently having been led by his officials to believe he was about to launch free trade negotiations with China based on his progressive trade agenda. Beijing sent him packing with a flea in the ear. Beijing made it clear that trying to include elements like gender equality, human rights, and environmental protection into commercial treaties is a gross interference in China's domestic affairs. That raises questions about whether it is possible for Canada to have anything other than basic WTO trade relations with PRC. I severely doubt if it is. Most bilateral diplomatic relations are measured not just by the balance of two-way trade. Other elements in the relationship are taken into consideration when judging the overall value of the partnership. These include such things as mutual security agreements, partnership in global diplomacy, and common civic values. Very few, if any, of those other bonds are possible between Canada and the PRC. I think that that's a very important matter for us to consider coming out of the Huawei affair, that our relations with the PRC are based solely on trade. So when things go wrong, we have no other buffers in the relationship. A good comparison would be, say, to look at the relationship with Japan or with South Korea or some other Asian countries, and one sees immediately that we have much broader and deeper relations with them, so that if anything goes wrong in one area, we have room for movement. With the PRC, we have only trade, so we have nothing to fall back on when things go wrong. Yet over the decades, successive Canadian governments have tried to deepen the relationship with Beijing to include some of those other elements. Success has been minimal. To take one of many examples, Canada spent scores of millions of dollars in the 1990s on a program intended to instill respect for the rule of law and the independent judiciary in the PRC. All it did was to reinforce the belief in the CCP that the rule of law is a threat to the survival of the one-party state. The program did convince some Chinese lawyers that the rule of law was a good thing. However, some of them made the mistake of taking those lessons seriously and defending in court people whom the CCP was determined to put in prison. Those lawyers thus became a threat to the established order, and several of them are now in prison on trumped-up charges of fraud or income tax evasion or anything else that came to hand. So what has influenced the Canada-China relationship? It's immediately evident that the two countries expect very different things from our relationship. On the Canadian side, the central theme for close to a century has been a highly romanticized vision of first imperial China and now the CCP ruled China, and of having been seduced to the civic, and of believing that they could seduce the CCP to the civic reform by exposure to Canadian institutions and society. Meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party has been pursuing a carefully constructed campaign of intrusion into Canadian affairs and with defined goals. The aim is to suck out the greatest benefit possible from for the party's purposes, while doing its best to ensure that the Chinese citizens under its control are not infected by alien ideas and expectations. Canada's romantic view of China began with the sending of hundreds of Canadian missionaries there in the first half of the last century. That was the heyday of the Canadian missionaries in China. They were mostly Presbyterians and Methodists who morphed into the United Church of Canada in 1925. Most of those missionaries were inspired by membership in the student Christian movement, which was popular at Canadian universities at that time. They were imbued with the notions popular at that time of the social gospel. This held that if heathens could not be persuaded to be Christians, at least they could be shown how to better order their lives. Thus, cleanliness in some circumstances was better than godliness. Indeed, the West China Mission, its center was in Chengdu in Sichuan province. They built a huge hospital complex there. It is still the largest hospital in China, 7,000 beds. It was taken over by the CCP in 1949. But the social gospel ethic and the missionaries and their children born and brought up in China, who are called Mish Kids, have had a profound influence not only on Canadian policy towards China, but also on the whole culture of the Department of External Affairs under its many names. Very many of the officials responsible for the founding and building of the department in the 1940s and 1950s came out of the student Christian movement and the community of Canadian missionaries. Canada's diplomatic mission to the Kuomintang government of Chiang Kai-shek in the 1930s and 40s was staffed largely by the missionary community, and the first 3 ambassadors to Beijing after recognition in 1970 were Mish Kids. The CCP, and especially Mao Zedong's right-hand man, Zhou Enlai, found in the early 1940s that Canada's missionaries and their children were temperamentally inclined to support the communists rather than the Kuomintang. Zhou Enlai especially found it easy to persuade the Canadians that the CCP was not really a Marxist revolutionary party. The party's main objective was just agrarian reform and giving land to the peasants. The CCP's blandishments were very successful and led Canadians to believe the fiction that they had a special relationship with the Beijing regime. Norman Bethune, of course, is the patron saint of Canadian self-delusion to that score. But he has been followed by others, such as John Diefenbaker's Agriculture Minister Alvin Hamilton, who became one of the most avid spokespeople for the communist regime in the 1950s and 60s. But in the 1960s, the CCP and its agents of influence had learned how to play the Canadian establishment with great skill. The party paid much attention to the nuances of the Canada-United States relationship and became adept at tweaking Canadian anti-Americanism during the Vietnam War. And as we have seen with some of the responses to Ms. Meng's extradition case, that remains a skill that Beijing loves to employ. At the same time, the CCP understands Canadian sensitivities about racism and always employs that tactic when Beijing is attacked. Canada's recognition of the PRC in 1970 opened up China to the world, but it also opened up Canada to the CCP. The balance of trade, which had been in Canada's favor, quickly reversed and has remained that way. China now sells us 3 times more than it buys, and what it buys from Canada is still the same shopping list of grains and natural resources as in the 1960s, though in larger quantities. Yet the myth abides among Canadian businesses, mesmerized by the elusive market of 1.3 billion people, that eventually the CCP will have to open its market to foreign enterprises. One of the CCP's most significant successes in its campaign in Canada has been to divert and deflect Canadian attention and energy away from forging broad alliances with other countries in Asia. Several of them, such as Japan, South Korea, and some of the countries of South and Southeast Asia, are better trade, investment, political, diplomatic, cultural, and security fits for Canada than is the PRC. But we have largely ignored them, or at least not put nearly enough emphasis on them. When Zhu Rongji was economic czar and prime minister at the beginning of the century, there was reason for optimism that true market reform would happen. That hope has now been killed and buried by President and party leader Xi Jinping since he came to power in 2012. Xi has not only put the muscle of government behind state-owned enterprises, he has purposefully diminished the role of both domestic and foreign private companies. For example, laws have been enacted a couple of years ago that require all private, foreign, and domestic companies to have Communist Party cells. These cells inevitably come to dominate management and policy making, and anyone who questions whether ostensible private PRC companies in Canada, such as Huawei, are controlled by the CCP should remember that. After the establishment of diplomatic relations in 1970, Canadian companies and universities opened up as sources of technology for the CCP needed for industrialization. Those relationships started as perfectly legitimate development initiatives, but swiftly developed into opportunities to steal Canadian intellectual property. Increasing dependence by Canadian universities and colleges on revenues from foreign students, often in the face of stalled or reduced provincial funding, is now in danger in some cases of undermining academic freedom. There are now several Canadian universities who more than half of whose tuition revenue comes from Chinese students. Then there's the whole issue of the questionable credibility of the scores of so-called Canadian schools that have sprung up in China to feed ostensibly qualified students into Canadian tertiary institutions. Yet somehow the mythology has continued among Canadian political, academic, and business elites that they have a special influence with the CCP that one day will pay off, not only in trade, but also in reform, both of Beijing's approach to its own citizens and to the rest of the world. What the Huawei-Meng affair forces us to confront is that there is little or no evidence of those advances. So what are the objectives of the CCP in dealing with Canada, and how have they gone about it? I must emphasize here that Canada is not alone as a target of influence and intimidation by the CCP. I'm sure many of you here were here for Clive Hamilton's presentation a couple of months ago when he recounted what has happened in Australia, which is very, very similar. In fact, it's almost an identical program of influence and intimidation as has happened in Canada. So very similar campaigns have been in Australia, the United States, New Zealand, some of the European countries. There are, by general agreement amongst various intelligence agencies, 4 headlines under which the CCP operates. Number 1 on the list is the ability to influence the political life of Canada and the other target countries and to push them in directions favourable to the CCP objectives. In the 1940s through the 1960s, this focused on getting Canada to abandon recognition of the Kuomintang, in exile on Taiwan by that time, as the legitimate government of China, and to shift recognition to the CCP. After the success of that campaign in 1970, the CCP's attention shifted to ensuring that Canada did not become an international critic of Beijing's human rights or territorial policies. That campaign also has been largely successful. So we saw only marginal criticism of the PRC and a swift return to normal relations after the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. Similarly, there has been little noise from either major government party in Ottawa over the cultural genocide and worse in Tibet and Xinjiang, or even more directly pertinent to Canada, the increased repression in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a Canadian city to all intents and purposes. It's got a population of about 12 million, about 12 million now, of which 1 in 12 people are Canadian citizens at any one time. I remember I did a story at the time of the handover. Somebody slipped me the disaster scenario report about what Canada would do if the PLA came over the border with guns blazing, and it was reckoned at that time that Canada would be responsible for evacuating 500,000 people from Hong Kong who had legitimate reason to live in Canada. At any one time, there's about 350 to 500,000 Canadians in Hong Kong. What happens there is a domestic issue for us, and we should be a lot more voluble about it than we are. Equally, Beijing's military occupation of the South China Sea, in defiance of international law, has gone largely unremarked by Ottawa. Second on the CCP's list of priorities has been the acquisition by hook or by crook of Canadian and other Western technologies. At first, this was simply to ignite China's industrial revolution, and in the 1980s, the creation of the state-managed market economy. But in the last 20 years, the purpose of technology acquisition has been to fix the PRC's place as a global dominant economic, political, and military power. More recently, that the PRC's acquisition of foreign technology and scientific skills has enabled China to become an innovator. Again, the Huawei story is in part about who is going to dominate the next generation of global communications technology, and therefore the generations after that. The third objective of the CCP's campaign of influence has been to ensure access to Canadian natural resources and agricultural products, and to the Canadian market for Chinese manufactured goods. That too has been successful. Not only do grains, ores, forest products, and energy still dominate the list of what Canada sells to China every year, Chinese companies, both state-owned and ostensibly private, have been able to buy into the Canadian resource sector. Meanwhile, in Canada's consumer marketplace, it is PRC manufactured goods that dominate in many areas. The fourth area where the CCP and where the CCP has dominated is to be able to operate in Canada to intimidate and control Canadians who it considers dissidents and a threat to the party's continued rule. These Canadians are mostly, but not exclusively, Chinese, Tibetan, Uyghur, and Taiwanese of Taiwanese heritage. CCP agents aim to silence, through intimidation, people in Canada who are active in political groups advocating reform in China and its occupied territories. Anastasia, we heard from in the book. I have got a whole list of examples of people who have gone through similar experiences in dealing with or when attacked by agents of the CCP. One of the most troubling aspects of the whole issue of Canada-PRC relations is the way CCP agents of the Ministry of State Security have been able to operate in Canada, threatening Canadian citizens. To achieve these four objectives, the CCP has used and created an oppressive collection of tools. To exert pressure in the political, business, academic, and media sectors, the CCP has courted or deployed an army of what are known as agents of influence. My definition of an agent of influence is someone who is in a position to sway public opinion or official actions and decisions. He or she uses that position to advance the priorities of the Chinese Communist Party in anticipation of receiving benefits from Beijing. Those benefits may be financial privilege in commercial partnerships, for example, or they may sustain or increase the agent's status in Canada. An academic's career or the success of a consultancy, for instance, may be enhanced by exceptional access to sources in China. The anticipation of benefits is key to the motivation of the agent of influence, I think, because those benefits can be, and sometimes are, taken away if the agent doesn't perform. The New Zealand academic, Anne-Marie Brady, who has done unmatched work on the CCP's methods for controlling and suborning foreigners, makes a powerful point. In her book, Making the Foreign Serve China, she says the CCP does not regard bestowing on a foreigner the title Friend of China as an honor. The party regards it as a job description, she says. I think if we look around us and we look at the people who have been called sometimes friends of China, we can see it is indeed a job description. China has all the usual intelligence and security agencies with which we are familiar at home and amongst our allies. But what sets China apart is the United Front Works Department. This organization has a fascinating history, but we need only concern ourselves with the current operations. President Xi Jinping has called the United Front the CCP's magic weapon, and it can indeed be that. Put bluntly, the United Front is the CCP's main agent for political warfare. It portrays itself as a public relations and soft power agency, a Panda, or if you like, but its reach and methods go well beyond that. The United Front's main focus is on using the social and political weaknesses in target countries to further the CCP's aims. And under President Xi, the front has been given not only massive new resources of money and staff, but also wider responsibilities. There are now United Front units in almost all CCP agencies and also all government departments operating at home and abroad. On the foreign stage, the United Front has units in all the Chinese embassies and consulates, and it is the sponsor and manager of a whole host of organizations that do not appear to be arms of the CCP's campaign of influence and intrusion. For example, the now largely discredited Confucius Centers, Confucius Institutes, inserted in Canadian colleges, universities, and high schools, are ostensibly Chinese language and cultural centers paid for by Beijing under the Ministry of Education to promote mutual understanding in target countries. In reality, the Confucius Institutes are under the wing of the United Front and are essentially espionage outposts of Beijing's embassies and consulates. They are used primarily to spy on, control, and conscript Chinese students on campus, but also to recruit friends from amongst the academic staff, and as we have seen with the Huawei case, help identify useful technological research. The United Front also oversees a massive collection of organizations such as friendship societies, business alliances, twin cities and towns associations, professional associations, and many more, often created hastily for specific purposes. A useful rule of thumb is that if a Canada-China organization has the word friendship in it, it is usually a United Front operation. The Canadian Security Intelligence Service has been warning Canadian political leaders about the activities of the United Front at least since the late 1990s. But for the political leaders, the advice of their intelligence chiefs is only one of a number of considerations that they've had to make, and by and large, they have until fairly recently downplayed the importance of United Front incursions here. Though in recent years, the activities and obvious threat of the United Front have grown not only in Canada, but also amongst Canadian allies, and there's clearly been more and more exchange of information about the United Front amongst our intelligence allies. So we are beginning to see Ottawa's departments, especially Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, taking the threat seriously. Last May, for example, Ottawa refused visas to 200 would-be delegates to a conference in Vancouver of the World Guangdong Community Federation. The reasons given for the refusal were opaque, but there's no question that the Federation is a United Front operation. It seeks to influence the diaspora of people from China's southern Guangdong province, which is the Canton-speaking region that includes Hong Kong. So where do we go from here? It is important, I think, to make very clear to ourselves that we cannot disengage from China and the PRC. It is the world's second largest economy and set to be the biggest within a few years, next year according to Standard Chartered Bank. The PRC is also an increasingly potent global political and military power. And we have about 1.5 million people of Chinese heritage in our Canadian population who give us a potent link to China. So the questions are how much we engage with China and on what terms. It will take time for a consensus on that to emerge once the current crisis is over. I think there's going to be a significant public resistance here to normalizing relations very quickly with the People's Republic of China. This hostage-taking of the two Michaels has, I think, touched a nerve with the Canadian public that took political leaders by surprise, but which they will have to take into account as we renew relations with Beijing. I hope and expect that when new initiatives between the two countries are put on the table, the first question will always be, what benefit to Canada and Canadians can we honestly and realistically expect from the deal? My hope is that the answer is untainted by the hucksterism and self-delusion that has dominated until now. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you'll agree with me that it's hard to imagine what more we could learn. I think that Jonathan has covered so brilliantly the points that are concerning so many of us about China's presence and activities in Canada. But we have, of course, with us tonight Bob Fife from the Globe and Mail's Ottawa Bureau, and the head of the Ottawa Bureau. And of course, Bob is uniquely positioned, I think, given the work that he's been doing on many of these issues, trying to bring them to the attention of Canadians through his powerful platform in the Globe. Bob has kindly agreed to engage in conversation with Jonathan to explore in greater depth some of the points that he's raised, and perhaps some others that Jonathan didn't have a chance to touch on. Of course, Bob is the former host of CTV's Question Period. He's one of Canada's most respected journalists. He's broken many major stories throughout his long career, including the Senate expense scandal, and right up to current headlines surrounding the PMO, the former Justice Minister, and SNC Lavalin. Bob has won many awards for his journalism. He's also the author of several books, and I turn things over to Bob and Jonathan.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to ask Jonathan a couple of questions, then I want to get questions from the audience, and I thank you very much for standing up for a long period of time, and we will get to you fairly quickly. Just before I start to talk to Jonathan, I just want everybody to know that I've known Jonathan for many, many years. When he was a long-time foreign correspondent and for Southern News when I knew him, and when I was traveling with the Prime Minister abroad to Asia and Africa, Jonathan was the correspondent there, and he was always so incredibly generous with his knowledge and his insight, which I immediately stole and put it in my copy, which I am deeply appreciative. Coming to that, Jonathan, when you and I were in China in 1994, when Jean Chrétien and the Team Canada group of business, every major business leader in Canada was part of that organization, part of that group. And there was so much hope that China was going to be not only a market for Canadian goods, but an opportunity to change the society so that, you know, it would be a trained civil service, a law and order society, and eventually a democracy as the middle class came. That thinking still seems to be predominant in Canadian society, and I wonder why you think that is the case.
Well, you know, a lot of the book deals with that, but it's delusion on our part. It really is, because what is quite clear from our experience, and you know, it's a good point to pick 1994 and the first Team Canada trip, because remember, this was the first sort of international bringing China out of the purdah it had been placed in after the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. Canada was signaling to China at that point that you know, you're forgiven now. You can come back into the community of world nations, and it was Canada playing almost the same role as it had played in 1970 when it was the first major Western country to give diplomatic relations or recognition to the PRC. So we played the same role again, and I think that we were used by the PRC and the Communist Party, who realized that we were easily conned. And I think that that has carried on right up until the present day. I think what it may have begun to change when Trudeau got his flea in his ear in December in 2017 in Beijing. And certainly I think the Huawei affair now has pulled them up short. But I still think it's going to take a while before all our institutions who have so heavily invested in the notion that reform is just around the corner in China, it's going to take a while before they are disabused, I'm afraid.
I want to ask you this in terms of how the corporate elite sees China, because there's a lot of evidence, including in Canada, but around the world, of China stealing stealing Western technology, and closing off 62 sectors of the Chinese economy is completely closed off to foreign investors. So we sell them lobsters and wheat and some financial services, but huge sectors of the economy where the Western world could actually go in and make money is closed off. But China is wisely smart enough to know that they can come into our sectors of the economy, and if they're not stealing the technology, they're buying companies for the technology and then taking it back to China. Why is it that the Canadian corporate elite, it's not just the Canadian, I think it's Australian and New Zealand as well.
And Americans as well.
And Americans. Why is that?
Well, I think they see what they believe is a market of 1.3 billion people, and they think, gee, if I can only sell a toothbrush to every one of them. But of course, China is not a market of 1.3 billion people. It is many markets of maybe 50 million. But apart from that, I think that business people, I've written columns for business newspapers for many, many years now, and I've watched Canadian business operating around the world. And you know what always trips up business people? They know their businesses, they know marketing, they know production, all that sort of thing. They are always tripped up by politics and culture. And so whenever I've written for business papers, I always write about the politics and the culture of the places where they're operating, because they don't know enough about it. They don't look at it, they don't learn it, they don't understand it. There are a few exceptions. There's some companies who do and who are broadly successful abroad. But most Canadian business people and the others we mentioned, the Australians, New Zealanders, and Americans and Europeans, they just look at the size of the market and they think, how many toothbrushes can I sell? There's a big hole in the education of business students in our country.
So one of the things that, as my colleague Steve Chase and I have begun to look at China's influence in Canada, and we know from Clive Hamilton's book the extent of Chinese influence amongst the diaspora in Australia, for example, and New Zealand, but I hadn't realized that the same tactics that are being used in Australia, for example, are being used in Canada amongst mainly Chinese mainland immigrants who have family back in China. And could you just sort of explain how these Chinese consulates work and the harassment that they go through and the influence that they play at the local level and cultural and community groups?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Anastasia's story is a pretty classic one. The influence of the consulates is quite extraordinary. I mean, to begin with, there are now hardly any Chinese media which are not under the influence of the local consulate or the embassy. They've been very, very purposeful, starting really in the 1990s. I first started hearing from friends of mine in the Chinese-Canadian community in Vancouver that the local Chinese language papers there were sort of ending political columns and just having lifestyle columns. And that has carried on. As I say, there are now very, very few Chinese language media outlets, whether they're broadcast or print, which are not under the control one way or another of the consulate or the embassy. And in terms of direct intimidation, it goes very much the way Anastasia said. The officials, sometimes from the local consulate, but sometimes Ministry of State Security agents who come into Canada as tourists or in business delegations, they will approach somebody. They will often get a relative in China who's been detained and put them on the phone, and they will be persuaded to say, please stop your political activity, it's hurting the family, so on and so forth. It's pretty brutal and pretty direct, it really is. There are also, of course, many people in Canada who also have business interests in China, and that makes them vulnerable to pressure, and that's used a lot. There are many instances, and I've talked about some in the book where people who are politically active lose their jobs, not through any direct attack, but simply because pressure is put on their employer, who happens to also have business interests in China. They'll use anything that comes to hand, but those are just some of them. They're pretty brutal and pretty direct, and very successful.
And one more question, and I'll open it up because we're anxious to hear from the audience. What do you see the new aggressiveness of President Xi? I mean, this is not something that we have been familiar with. Not that they haven't been throwing their weight around, but this is completely different.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, and I think it's because they're beginning to realize that their lack of political legitimacy is a problem. You know, I've followed and watched for many years now why so much money is coming out of China, because all the people who have the money are red nobility. You know, these are people who are close to the Communist Party, either members themselves or related to it. They've made huge amounts of money through that connection, but for the last 10, 15 years, huge amounts of money have been coming out of China. In 2015, $1 trillion illegally out of China, just in that 1 year. August that year, $250 billion. Now, not all of it went into apartments in Vancouver or in Scarborough. It's gone all around the world. But you have to wonder, when that amount of money is coming out of the country, what are they scared of? You know, why are they so interested in getting assets stowed overseas? Part of it, I suspect, was Xi Jinping's anti-corruption drive, because, you know, in a country with no rule of law, you have no protection. If the wind turns against you, unless you've got assets stowed abroad, you're done for. And as we know, even somebody like Bo Xilai, the party boss of Chongqing, he made a play to get on the standing committee, and of course has ended up in prison. So, you know, you have no protection unless you've got assets abroad. So I think that's part of it. But I think it speaks to a wider uncertainty, which is, I think, very dangerous for us and for other countries, a wider uncertainty about its survival amongst the CCP. And so we've seen, for example, this tremendous emphasis by Xi Jinping on nationalism, on patriotism. We've seen the emphasis on the territorial claims, the taking control of the South China Sea. We've seen the Belt and Road Initiative, which is almost medieval in its clear desire to reimpose vassal state status on its neighbors. And I think it's something, you know, we ought to be very concerned about. Certainly, you know, my Taiwanese friends are deeply concerned about it, because they are very much on the front line of what is an imperial expansion by the Chinese Communist Party, I think in part at least as a matter of self-defense.
Okay, we're going to open that up for people to ask Jonathan questions. My only thing is no speeches, please. The woman in the back.
Yep.
Woman right in the back.
Okay, congratulations for your book, and I think it people have been waiting for such kind of book for so long time, many years, right? You know, like in Australia, because the media and because of their scholars, like the China experts, they really did their job. They wrote books, they write articles, they expose China's infiltration to Australia, and also in the US, the same thing, like the government and their think tanks. And they are like the media, they did report quite a lot. And Canada is quite behind. You know, like in your opinion, like is that because of Canadian academia or Canadian media, like unknowingly has been influenced by China, or like what's the reason why like people are not realizing that? So
I talk about this a bit in the book, and I say in the acknowledgements at the end, because I took the book entirely, apart from a couple of little incidents, almost entirely from the public record. And I did that purposefully to say, look, this story has been here the whole time. And I say also in the acknowledgements that really it is only the Canadian media and Robert and his colleagues amongst them, the leading amongst them, who've kept this story in the public eye in Canada. Our politicians, our academics, our business people have been terrible. They have been useless. And I think that one of the reasons is the difficult issue of racism. I think that people have been concerned that they would be accused of racism, which is a more sensitive issue here than, and certainly our historic treatment of people of Chinese heritage, than it has been in Australia or the United States. And it was a very difficult issue for me to get my head around how I was going to write the book, which is why you will see in the book I refer only to the Chinese Communist Party. I never refer in a blanket way to China or the Chinese people. And that is very purposeful, because what we are dealing with here is not the relationship between Canada and the Chinese people. It's between Canada and the Chinese Communist Party, which is not China and is not the Chinese people.
And as Jonathan points out in his book, this country has been deeply enriched by Chinese immigrants in this country. Now, next person who wants to...
I have a question. Actually, in Australia, because of the publicity, in last year, their parliament passed two legislations, one anti-interference legislation. One of them is to require that whoever is advocating, working for the foreign government have to register. And because of a lot of their prime minister, former prime minister, like elected official, right after they retire, they start work for the Chinese government. And
that happens here too.
Happens here as well.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and I think last few days there's a few articles that after this requirement for registration, a number of them start to quit working for the Chinese government. Do you think going forward, such a legislation is also necessary, like for Canada?
Well, we do have registries of lobbyists, don't we?
We have a registry of lobbyists, but a lot of politicians work for corporations, and they don't have to register because they're working for the...
There's one area where Australia was way behind us. They allowed until very recently, and I think the legislation has gone through now, I may be wrong, they allowed until very recently foreign entities to donate money to Australian political parties. And that was a real problem for them, because the CCP and its agents of one sort or another were donating massively to Australian political parties. We don't allow it. We do have one or two strange situations where Chinese companies, while they have not been allowed to donate to our political parties, they have been allowed to donate to such things as the Pierre Trudeau Foundation, things like that. And so there have been ways around this. But I agree with you. I mean, I think we need to tighten up a lot of the regulations on how we deal with foreign lobbyists. One thing I think that we really seriously need to do is look at why Canada is such a favourable money laundering place. We have no publicly available registries of beneficial owners of companies or of property, which has just made us an open door to money laundering, not only from red aristocrats from China, but from elsewhere as well. And I think about 60% of the illegal money that comes into Canada comes through things like false invoicing. And that means we're importing corruption. And I think we need to look very, very broadly at how we deal with corruption, whether it's people from government going to work for foreign entities, whether it's money laundering here. But it's about time we had a very, very close look at how we operate and our vulnerabilities in a whole variety of areas, and not just from agents of the Chinese Communist Party.
And just gentlemen here.
Thank you, Jonathan. I wonder if you could give us your views on how the Huawei question may unfold. At the moment, we have 3 of the Five Eyes partners who are adamant that it will not be permitted to participate in the 5G network development. And upon that, 5 nations rely for intelligence sharing.
Right.
Is this a wedge that's being cast between these 5? And how do you see this playing out?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I mean, one can imagine a number of scenarios, can't one? I mean, one could foresee this as being the death of that Five Eyes security intelligence sharing agreement that has operated since the Second World War. If Canada and Britain, for example, say, no, we think that the Huawei threat is manageable, which is what the British experts are saying at the moment, then probably what will happen is that the US will just close down the information that it shares, and to that extent, Five Eyes will be pretty much over. It'll be interesting to see whether our politicians and our experts and the British decide that in the end, keeping Five Eyes alive is more important than getting cheap switches from Huawei. I don't know what the outcome is going to be, quite honestly, but I think it's a pretty important moment in the whole history of shared intelligence amongst those 5 allies. Yeah.
Gentleman or woman, I'm sure somewhere way in the back. A gentleman in the back with his hand up.
I agree with you that China is taking advantage of our liberal laws. But aren't we just passing the buck? We can't even get our act together to build an energy east pipeline to displace imported oil. Shouldn't we do something about our economy ourselves instead of continuously blaming China for doing what it thinks is best for its own people?
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. Although I don't think we can. I don't think anyone is blaming China for doing what it thinks is best for its own people. I think that what I'm critical of China of, and critical of the Canadian establishment, if you like, for, is not responding and not identifying what is in fact happening. We should be pushing back, and we should have been pushing back for a long time, and we should be seeking other partners far more avidly than we have. I mentioned at the beginning that we don't pay nearly enough attention to Japan, to South Korea, to Indonesia, to Taiwan, to India, to Sri Lanka, to Malaysia, to other countries in Asia with whom we have much more sound, broad relationships than we do with China. And we don't need anything more than a basic WTO trade agreement with China. We're not going to get any benefits out of a free trade agreement with China. We should be putting our energies elsewhere.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask you, given how the Chinese Communist Party is seeing the reaction towards Huawei and even greater awareness of the United Front work, how do you see the United Front kind of changing its tactics to evolve to keep doing its work? Like, do you see what is the next step? Do you think for them, given the greater awareness that is being created now by work like from you Professor
Well,
Hamilton.
You probably need Dick Fadden, the former head of CSIS, here to answer that question. I'm sure that they will. The United Front has always evolved with the times. There's always, and I'm sure it will again. I'm sure it doesn't like the attention that is being turned on it. I had a call from a friend of mine who may or may not be associated with MI6 in Britain the other day, and he said, "Jonathan, you do realise that you've written a full report for the Chinese Communist Party on its successes and failures, that there will be now working groups in China who will be studying your book to see what they can do to improve their performance." Unfortunately, I mean, if they were all going to buy the book to do that, I would be happy about it. But of course, they will get one copy and photocopy it. So I don't know. I mean, I think we have to keep our eyes open. Undoubtedly, they will change tactics, and because they're not going to give up on, particularly on the ability to be able to intimidate people they see abroad as a threat to the survival of the one-party state.
Is this one?
How do you perceive China's relationship with Russia?
Intense mutual suspicion. It's an interesting one, and it changes quite a bit. I was in Vladivostok a few years ago in the Russian Far East, where they are apoplectic about China there, because they believe that they have at least 5 million, and sometimes the number goes up to 10 million, illegal immigrants from China in the Russian Far East, which is very sparsely populated to begin with. I mean, when I was in Vladivostok, there'd been riots in a local market just a few days before, because one of the things you can buy in the markets there are lovely fur hats and stuff like that, Russian-made ones. Anyway, some Chinese immigrants, illegal or otherwise, had come in, set up in that market. They'd gone round and they'd bought one sample of each of the sort of local brands of the hats. They disappeared, come back a week later, and were selling knockoffs, probably in catskin, at half the price. And it led to a riot. Police had to close down the whole market. So there is huge suspicion. There's also been a lot of property buying by surrogates there. Now and again, if Moscow and Beijing have coincidental interests, they work hand in hand. But Beijing has never forgotten that Russia, after 1949, never gave it the help that Mao thought that they deserved, and Stalin, frankly, insulted Mao. And that was when Mao and the CCP started turning to the diaspora to kickstart the industrialization of China when the Russians gave minimal assistance. So it's mutual suspicion. Sometimes their interests coincide. More often they don't.
So we're going to take two more questions, sir.
You used the term gift, describe the Huawei incident with regard to the arrest of two Canadians and also resentencing Canadian to death sentence. But Canada has received such kind of gifts before with regard to the arrest of Canadian citizen, Chinese Canadian of Uyghur. And the recent years, 2 years ago, and the Canadian citizen, Chinese Canadian, Sun Qian, who is a Falun Gong practitioner, 2 years ago, just for their belief, nothing, the rest is illegal. So why Canada did not, I would use treasure the gift they received before than now?
Well, at any one time, I remember when I was in Hong Kong, and I used to follow this very closely. At any one time, there are probably a dozen Canadians being held hostage of one form or another in Canada. Most of them are Canadians of Chinese heritage. Mostly the reasons for them being held is arguments over a contract with a Chinese partner. And I have to say, more often than not, those Canadian Chinese have been foolish enough to go into China on their Chinese nationality documents and not their Canadian passports, so they have no protection. But the whole issue of, as you raise it, Falun Gong members is a huge story in itself, and several of the cases that I cite in the book involve members of Falun Gong. And of course, you know, I mentioned Zhu Rongji's trip across here in the beginning of this evening. He went back, arrived back in Beijing Saturday night, went to bed, and there was a knock on his door in the Zhongnanhai leaders' compound the following morning, and he was told there were 15,000 demonstrators outside the Zhongnanhai in the center of Beijing. They were, of course, all Falun Gong followers who were there to protest against the treatment of the group, particularly in northern China. He met them, he met leaders, and he didn't see any particular problem. It was other members of the Chinese leadership who, thinking back to 1989, remembered that they had decided then never to allow any organization to survive that might prove a national threat. And I think it was the national aspect of Falun Gong that really scared them. And as you know, it was then declared an evil cult. But this was near the 10th anniversary, weeks leading up to the 10th anniversary of Tiananmen Square, and these 15,000 people, many of whom were middle-aged people who had been sort of loyal Communist Party officials in the middle ranks, had come from all over China without the Chinese security services knowing anything about it. And that's what scared them. They realized that here they were facing another national organization which could be a threat if it was allowed to survive. And so, as we know, they've done everything they can to destroy it.
So one final question, this man with his hand up here.
Hello, thank you. My name is Sherab Tarjan. I'm with the Canada-Tibet Committee. My question is, how much of these reactions, whether it's to Huawei issue or to Mercedes, Marriott, Delta, all these recent reactions are a show of insecurity rather than show of power from China?
From China? Well, as I said a few minutes ago about the flight of the money and the intense nationalism and patriotism, I think that that it's, in some ways, it is a demonstration of anxiety. I think that Xi and the Communist Party leaders realize that they're out on the end of the string now, that they have very little political legitimacy. They're trying to create that political legitimacy as well as keeping the authoritarian state in power. But, you know, and I will end with this little picture. You know, we've seen many authoritarian states collapse in recent years, and one of the things about them is that they look very solid. You know, they look absolutely fully armed and defensive, and then suddenly they collapse. You know, they're like a sheet of glass. Boom, all of a sudden it's broken pieces in the street. Now, I don't think that the People's Republic of China is going to collapse next week, but you never know. I mean, we didn't think that about the Soviet Union. You know, we didn't think it about Egypt or Libya or any of the other countries that collapsed in the Arab Spring. They all looked pretty solid. Whether it's the same with China, I have no idea, but I think authoritarian states are, by their very nature, they are brittle, I think is the word for it. They are brittle, and you never know when a tap in the right place will just make them collapse.
So I want to thank everybody for listening to Jonathan, and just to say, this is a really, really good book. It really tells you what's going on in Canada, and I encourage everybody to buy it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me thank Robert Fife and Jonathan Manthorpe on your behalf. I think they've done a wonderful job not only of digging into Jonathan's book, but also in helping to moderate the question period. I also want to mention that there are a number of people here who should be recognized. I no doubt can't do all of them. C.S. Leung, the former MP from Willowdale, I believe, Taiwanese born, is here with us, and we're delighted to see you here. David Kilgore, the former Secretary of State for Asia Pacific, who is also a senior fellow at MLI, is with us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you'll agree with me that what has happened this evening is that we have put on the table in an informed, thoughtful, dispassionate way responses to the questions that Canadians have been worried about for some time in terms of our relationship with China and what it really represents. This is what a national think tank looks like. Okay? And I am delighted that you have joined us this evening. I hope you will join us again for future events here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Again, ranked this year by the University of Pennsylvania International Think Tank Rankings, the top think tank in Ottawa, one of the tops in the entire country. We have a lot of work to do, and we hope that you will continue to support our efforts. We have a little table over here where I believe Jonathan has kindly consented to sit and sign until his arm will no longer work. And of course, we continue to have cheese and wine and so on in the dining room. Please help yourselves. Yeah, of course.